The initial months of Operation Barbarossa brought catastrophic failure to the Soviet Union. The blitzkrieg tactics of the Wehrmacht tore through Soviet defenses with shocking speed and efficiency. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed, captured, or simply scattered in the vast chaos of the retreating front. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had decimated the high command, leaving a void in experienced military leadership. Younger, less seasoned officers were thrust into impossible situations, often leading to panic and disorganized retreats. These massive, early losses threatened the very existence of the Soviet state and the communist regime. The German war machine seemed unstoppable, rolling eastward toward the critical cities of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. The sense of demoralization permeated every level of the Red Army and the Soviet population at large. Something drastic needed to be done to restore discipline and inject a desperate, brutal resolve into the fighting forces. The High Command became increasingly focused on accountability, viewing retreat not as a tactical necessity but as a crime. Any action short of standing firm until death was quickly interpreted as cowardice or even treachery. The staggering loss of territory and men demanded an immediate and ruthless response to prevent total collapse. The Soviet leadership understood that conventional motivational tactics were failing against the German juggernaut. They needed a system that would turn the fear of death from the enemy into an even greater fear of their own side. This period of crushing defeat laid the psychological groundwork for the most infamous and controversial military directive of the war. The strategic situation was dire, demanding extreme measures to stabilize the crumbling front lines. In July 1942, amidst the chaos of the Battle of Stalingrad, Joseph Stalin issued his infamous Order No. 227. This directive was immediately known by its chilling, non-negotiable slogan, "Not one step back." The order explicitly forbade any unauthorized retreat or withdrawal by any unit or formation in the entire Red Army. It established a ruthless policy of summary execution for anyone suspected of cowardice or desertion. Crucially, the order also mandated the creation of new, highly specialized military formations, the Penal Battalions, or Strafpartie. These new units were to be composed of officers and soldiers demoted for minor disciplinary infractions or alleged cowardice. They were literally given the worst and most dangerous missions, serving as a desperate, disposable shock force. Behind them, special blocking detachments from the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, were positioned. The sole purpose of these NKVD units was to shoot any soldier who attempted to retreat from the front line. The Penal Battalions were therefore fighting under a unique, terrifying dual threat, the Germans in front and their own side behind. The message of Order 227 was unmistakable and brutally clear to every soldier in the Red Army. You could not choose to run, you could only choose to advance or to die in your position. The psychological impact of this order was immediate, replacing the hope of a tactical withdrawal with the certainty of a frontal defense. It essentially institutionalized the concept of military sacrifice to an unprecedented and brutal degree. The Strafpartie were the living embodiment of the new, unforgiving national policy of total resistance. This was a mobilization not just of men and material, but of absolute terror and political will. The officers who formed these units knew their existence was a result of a system prioritizing survival over all else. The Penal Battalions were organized into two distinct categories: Officer Strafpartie and rank-and-file penal companies. Officers who had been stripped of their rank were sent to the larger battalions, serving as privates until their potential redemption. The soldiers and non-commissioned officers were assigned to the smaller penal companies attached to existing armies. A sentence to the Strafpartie was usually for a term of 1 to 3 months, often extended if they survived. The only way to achieve full military and legal rehabilitation was to prove one's bravery, usually by suffering a wound in battle. If a soldier was wounded and survived, his sentence was considered served, and his rights were restored completely. If a soldier died in action, his case was retroactively closed, and his family was informed he died a hero, restoring his honor. The penal units were always deployed to the hottest, most heavily defended sectors of the front line. Their missions were almost always suicidal, clearing minefields, taking heavily fortified heights, or serving as diversionary attacks. Their equipment was often rudimentary, sometimes consisting of little more than a rifle and the bare minimum of ammunition. The men within these units represented a complex cross-section of Soviet society and the Red Army. Some were genuinely talented officers who had made a single, costly error in the impossible conditions of the Eastern Front. Others were common criminals plucked directly from the Gulag system, offered a chance at freedom through combat. This mix of disgraced professionals and hardened criminals created a volatile, yet uniquely determined fighting force. They were not volunteers, they were men driven by a desperate, immediate need for survival and restoration. Their very existence was a stark testament to the Soviet government's absolute disregard for individual life. The Wehrmacht, particularly the High Command, initially viewed the penal battalions with cynical amusement and utter disdain. German intelligence quickly learned of the new Soviet formations and their unconventional composition. They saw the Strafpartie as an obvious sign of the Soviet system's desperation and internal weakness. The idea of sending criminals and failed officers into battle was considered a barbaric and inefficient waste of manpower. German officers would often joke about the quality of the cannon fodder being thrown at their impregnable lines. They believed these compromised units would possess no morale, no cohesion, and absolutely no fighting spirit. The penal battalions were expected to shatter and retreat after the first burst of sustained machine gun fire. This initial German perception was rooted in their own military culture of professional honor and disciplined service. The German army could not comprehend a military that intentionally degraded its own fighting strength in such a manner. They assumed that men fighting under duress from their own side would surrender or flee at the first opportunity. Propaganda units within the Wehrmacht sometimes used the existence of the penal units to demoralize Soviet prisoners. They mocked the Soviet state for forcing its own soldiers into such a hopeless and ignoble form of death. For a time, the arrival of a penal battalion on the opposing lines was almost a signal for the Germans to relax slightly. They anticipated a disorganized, easily repulsed attack that would soon become a mere mopping-up operation. This profound underestimation would prove to be one of the most critical miscalculations made by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The Germans focused only on the shame and the punishment, failing to grasp the power of the desperate chance for redemption. The Strafpartie were deployed with a chillingly simple tactical doctrine: overwhelm the enemy through sheer sacrifice. Their attacks were rarely nuanced or sophisticated, relying instead on a brutal, single-minded forward momentum. They were frequently used to probe enemy defenses, finding and fixing machine gun nests and artillery positions. Their role was to draw the heaviest fire, thus depleting the enemy's ammunition and revealing their strategic positions. This was done to clear the path for the regular, more valued Red Army units that would follow in the second wave. The penal troops understood their function was to die in large numbers so that others might live and advance. In the process of these sacrificial attacks, however, they developed a unique and fearsome combat effectiveness. Since retreat was impossible due to the NKVD blocking detachments, their only forward option was victory or death. This singular focus, born of desperation, made them capable of a suicidal ferocity that regular units could not sustain. They would press forward through barrages that would have caused any other unit to break and scatter immediately. Their willingness to close the distance rapidly, even when lightly armed, terrified the German defenders. Close quarters combat became the hallmark of the penal battalions, where training mattered less than sheer grit. The knowledge that a single wound meant freedom also paradoxically made them fearless in the face of fire. They did not fear being wounded, they feared failing their sentence and being executed by their own side. Their missions were the ultimate meat grinder operations, designed to maximize casualties on both sides with no concern for self-preservation. The penal units became notorious for achieving breakthroughs where everyone else had simply failed to even approach. For the men in the Strafpartie, life had been brutally simplified to a binary choice: a violent, honorable death or a terrifying, uncertain redemption. This stark reality stripped away the complexities of fear, replacing it with a focused, desperate will to survive the sentence. The alternative to the front line was a slow, agonizing death in the Soviet Gulag, a fate many considered far worse than a German bullet. The penal units often had minimal political indoctrination, their motivation being purely existential and immediate. The disgraced officers, in particular, fought to reclaim their lost honor and the respect of their families. The criminals fought for the chance to wipe their slate clean and escape the lifetime sentence that awaited them. This inherent tension between the two groups, disgraced intelligentsia and hardened underclass, forged a strange, potent bond. They were all united by the common, overwhelming desire to survive the 3-month sentence of hell. The conditions in the penal battalions were incredibly harsh, with meager rations and poor quality equipment. They were often deliberately placed on the most exposed positions, serving as bait for German counterattacks. Yet, in this environment of absolute degradation, a fierce, almost fanatical unit cohesion began to form. Their officers, themselves often serving their own sentence, led from the very front with reckless abandon. There was no sense of class or political difference when all men were equally expendable in the eyes of the High Command. They fought with a savage intensity, fueled by a mixture of deep personal resentment and desperate hope. The German troops facing them started to recognize the unique, terrifying nature of these relentless Soviet assaults. They were men who had nothing left to lose, which ironically made them the most dangerous soldiers on the entire Eastern Front. The strategic value of the penal battalions became increasingly clear to the Soviet High Command as the war dragged on. They were, in effect, a readily available, psychologically primed reserve force for the most critical breakthroughs. When a regular unit had exhausted itself on a particularly strong German position, the Strafpartie were brought in. Their arrival signaled to both sides that the position was considered absolutely vital and must be taken at all costs. They were often thrown into battle immediately after a brief, terrifying march to the front, with no time for rest or detailed planning. The Germans soon learned to dread the sound of a new, desperate Soviet assault beginning after a previous one had failed. The Strafpartie demonstrated an uncanny ability to find the weak points in a seemingly unbroken line of defense. They would exploit the slightest pause in the German firing, surging forward into the gaps with stunning speed and ferocity. Their human cost was astronomical, with some penal battalions suffering casualty rates as high as 80% in a single engagement. However, the Red Army was willing to pay this terrible price for the critical objectives they were tasked with taking. The battalions became the Soviet Union's unbreakable, if morally compromised, steel reserve for the most challenging tasks. Their success was a victory of sheer, unyielding human will over professional, entrenched military defense. The German forces, accustomed to a predictable cycle of attack and retreat, found the Strafbat tenacity deeply unsettling. They had never encountered a foe so completely divorced from the normal calculation of self-preservation. The battles involving the penal units often devolved into savage, hand-to-hand trench warfare of extreme brutality. These units were designed to be the ultimate, terrifying proof of the Soviet Union's absolute commitment to winning the war at any expense. The penal battalions earned their grim reputation by consistently achieving objectives deemed impossible by regular Red Army units. Taking a heavily fortified, elevated position was the classic scenario where a Strafbat was guaranteed to be deployed. Heights offered the German defenders a huge tactical advantage, providing clear lines of fire and superior observation. Conventional attacks on these positions often resulted in entire regiments being decimated before reaching the first line of defense. The Strafbat approach involved a relentless, chaotic, and terrifying advance up the slopes under continuous fire. They would often move without concern for cover, relying on the sheer concentration of their attack to punch through. German machine gunners quickly realized they could not stop the human wave, only delay its inevitable arrival. The momentum of the penal attack was rarely lost, even as entire squads were cut down by defensive fire. In one famous, though historically hard to verify, instance, a penal company took a key hill near Stalingrad after 4 regular divisions failed. The German officers, who had previously scoffed at the convict soldiers, were forced to watch in disbelief. They saw men continue to advance even after being severely wounded, driven by the lure of redemption. The moment the penal troops reached the summit was a psychological victory felt across the entire front. It proved that the seemingly insurmountable German defenses could, in fact, be broken by sheer, desperate will. The successful capture of a height by a penal unit always came at a horrific cost in human life. However, once the objective was secured, the strategic gain for the larger Soviet offensive was often enormous and disproportionate. The sight of the red banner finally planted on a contested hill, placed there by a disgraced soldier, was a powerful symbol. The German perspective on the Soviet penal battalions underwent a drastic and fearful transformation. The initial scorn was quickly replaced by a grudging, deeply disturbed respect for their impossible fighting spirit. German frontline reports began to consistently highlight the fanatical and suicidal nature of the Strafbat attacks. They noted that these men fought without the usual considerations of military tactics or self-preservation. The German soldiers realized that these were not mere cowards or criminals, but men fighting a private war for their own survival. They were facing opponents who had been stripped of everything except a fierce desire to reclaim their place in the world. This meant the standard psychological warfare tactics employed by the Wehrmacht had virtually no effect on them. The enemy that had once been dismissed as a joke now became one of the most terrifying foes on the battlefield. A German intelligence report from 1943 noted that the penal battalions were the hardest-hitting units the Soviets possess. This sentiment acknowledged the brutal truth that desperation could be a far more potent motivator than political loyalty. The German officers stopped laughing when they realized the cost of holding a position against a penal unit was devastating. Their casualty rates in battles against the Strafpartie began to soar to levels previously thought impossible. The realization set in that the Soviet system, in its brutality, had found a way to weaponize shame and the instinct for survival. The Strafpartie had, through their actions, forced the German High Command to fundamentally reassess Soviet resolve. Their successful, bloody captures of key strategic points served as undeniable, horrifying proof of their effectiveness. The scorn turned into a cold, professional wariness reserved only for the most formidable and unpredictable adversaries. The primary motivator for every soldier in the penal battalion was the strict and unambiguous redemption clause. The promise of having all past crimes and dishonor erased upon shedding blood for the motherland was a powerful law. If a penal soldier was seriously wounded in battle, his term was immediately considered served, and his sentence was nullified. He was then returned to a regular Red Army unit, often with a promotion and full restoration of his civil rights. This system created an intense, paradoxical incentive. The men sought not to avoid the fight, but to survive a serious injury. They knew that the only guaranteed escape from the Strafpartie's death sentence was to earn a ticket out via a wound. This made them uniquely willing to expose themselves to enemy fire, moving directly into the most dangerous areas of the fight. For the many disgraced officers, this was the only pathway back to their careers and the respect of their peers. For the criminals, it was the only chance to avoid being sent back to the frozen misery of the Gulag system. The sight of a penal soldier being helped off the battlefield, bleeding but beaming with relief, was a common one. He was no longer a penal soldier, he was a redeemed hero who had paid his debt in blood. The political officers overseeing the battalions meticulously tracked the casualties to ensure the redemption process was followed. This adherence to the clause, despite the overall brutality, gave the penal system its strange and grim credibility. It was a contract written in blood, and the Soviet state held up its end of the bargain, however costly the transaction. The concept of washing away shame through sacrifice became a powerful psychological tool for the Soviet military. The victory secured by the Soviet penal battalions came at a human cost that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Their casualty rates were often several times higher than those of the regular Red Army units they were supporting. The sheer number of men who died in the fields and trenches while serving their sentence is staggering and largely unrecorded. Because they were fighting as penal troops, their official records were often deliberately sparse or ambiguous. Many of the men who fell did so without a formal unit designation, their names simply lost to the chaos of the front. While those who died had their records cleared, the history books often failed to fully acknowledge their terrible sacrifice. They were viewed by some regular soldiers with a mixture of pity, fear, and profound respect for their desperate courage. The legacy of the Strafpartie is one of the darkest and most morally complex chapters of the Eastern Front. It highlights the Soviet leadership's readiness to expend human life as a simple resource in the defense of the state. The very notion of forcing men to choose between a guaranteed execution and an impossible frontal assault is horrifying. Yet, the strategic fact remains that the penal battalions were instrumental in key, bloody victories throughout the war. They stabilized collapsing lines, they achieved critical breakthroughs, and they paid the heaviest price for the Soviet advance. Their sacrifices bought precious time and secured vital ground for the main forces of the Red Army to exploit. The men of the Strafpartie were the essential, hidden engine of many major Soviet operations, performing the most brutal work. Their stories were often suppressed after the war, deemed too sensitive or politically inconvenient for the official narrative of heroism. The story of the Soviet penal battalions remains a contentious and important subject in the history of World War II. For decades after the war, their existence was a topic largely shrouded in secrecy and Soviet official silence. The surviving veterans of the Strafpartie carried their story with a unique combination of pride and deep, internal shame. They had been condemned and then redeemed, an experience that set them apart from all other Soviet veterans. The historical truth is that these units were a brutal, yet demonstrably effective, military innovation born of desperation. They symbolized the absolute, existential nature of the total war fought on the Eastern Front by the Soviet Union. Their success forced a complete re-evaluation of military morale and the limits of human endurance under duress. Modern historians continue to debate the exact number of men who served and died in these unique formations. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of officers and soldiers passed through the ranks of the penal battalions. The actions of the Strafpartie ultimately helped shift the psychological balance of power on the front line. They were the men who proved to the Germans that Soviet resistance would not just hold, but would fight on, relentlessly, against all odds. The German officers stopped laughing because they witnessed men fight not for ideology, but for a second chance at life. The penal battalions were the ultimate expression of Stalin's chilling principle that victory must be achieved at any cost. Their legend endures as a powerful testament to the desperate heroism that can be forged in the crucible of utter terror. The men of the Strafpartie took the heights no one else could, forever etching their bloody, defiant memory into the annals of history.